The story of Jimmy Kimmel's cancellation by Disney, framed as a cowardly surrender to political forces, brings to the forefront the fragile balance between corporate power and the principle of free expression. When we talk about free expression, we often imagine it as a constitutional right, as something protected firmly by the First Amendment, but in reality, the arenas where most voices are amplified, the television networks, streaming services, publishing houses, and entertainment giants, are not neutral spaces. They are governed by corporations whose primary loyalty is not to free speech, but to shareholders, profits, and brand preservation. This distinction is important because it explains why decisions like Disney's resonate far beyond one television show. The cancellation of a popular late-night host who has built his career on political satire, emotional authenticity, and cultural critique is not simply a programming adjustment. It is a symbol of how power operates when politics and commerce collide. Jimmy Kimmel, like many late-night hosts before him, carved a reputation not just for humor, but for wielding humor as a vehicle for commentary. He has been unafraid to criticize powerful figures, including former President Donald Trump, and in doing so he became part of a long tradition of comedians who act as cultural critics, pushing back against those in power. The audience expects this role, and it has been part of the very DNA of late-night television since the days of Johnny Carson and beyond. However, when Disney makes a decision to silence that voice, whether explicitly under pressure or implicitly out of fear of backlash, it communicates something much larger. It signals that corporations, which increasingly control the platforms where speech can be heard, are willing to compromise free expression if it means shielding themselves from political conflict or financial risk. That is where the danger lies, because what is at stake is not just one celebrity's career but the public's access to dissenting voices. When corporate leaders calculate the risks of controversy, they often weigh whether political figures have the power to retaliate, to mobilize boycotts, or to weaponize government oversight. Trump's regime has demonstrated a remarkable ability to do exactly that, turning criticism into personal vendettas, encouraging supporters to boycott companies, and even hinting at regulatory retribution. For Disney, one of the most recognizable corporations in the world, the temptation to avoid becoming the next target of political wrath is clear. Yet, when such a powerful company folds under pressure, it doesn't just protect itself, it sets a precedent for others. If Disney, with all its vast resources and cultural influence, chooses to silence a comedian rather than stand firm, smaller companies will follow that lead. The chilling effect becomes widespread, and soon the boundaries of what can be said in the public sphere shrink dramatically. This situation forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that free expression in the United States, while legally protected from government censorship, is increasingly vulnerable to corporate censorship. The gatekeepers of modern speech are not only the courts or Congress but the boardrooms and executives who decide which voices are too risky, too controversial, or too politically inconvenient. When those decisions are influenced by fear of powerful political figures, it blurs the line between private business decisions and political censorship. It becomes a form of indirect control, where the government doesn't have to legislate censorship because corporations, eager to avoid conflict, do it voluntarily. That dynamic is insidious, and it should alarm anyone who believes in the value of a vibrant, diverse public discourse. Moreover, this moment reflects a broader cultural battle. Comedy has long been a refuge for truth-telling, for exposing hypocrisy, and for reminding audiences that power should never go unquestioned. When corporations strip comedians of their platforms under political pressure, they strip society of a critical lens through which to view authority. Kimmel's humor, whether one agreed with it or not, provided a counterweight to the carefully polished narratives of politicians. It was raw, often emotional, sometimes controversial, but always rooted in the idea that comedy can shine a light on what others would prefer to keep in the shadows. The loss of that voice sends a chilling message not only to comedians but to journalists, artists, and other cultural figures who see the walls of acceptable speech closing in. The issue is compounded by the current climate in Congress, where chaos and dysfunction only amplify the sense that traditional checks and balances are failing. If lawmakers are unable or unwilling to protect the principles of open debate and free expression, then the responsibility falls even more heavily on cultural institutions. Yet those very institutions, rather than defending independence, appear to be retreating. Disney's choice is not simply an isolated corporate decision, it mirrors a larger retreat across industries where silence and compliance are seen as safer than confrontation. The ripple effects extend beyond media and entertainment into academia, publishing, and technology, creating a landscape where self-censorship becomes normalized and critical voices are preemptively silenced before they even have the chance to speak. Consider, too, the role of the audience in this dynamic. Viewers are not passive consumers of entertainment, they are part of the public sphere where ideas are exchanged and debated. By removing voices like Kimmel's, corporations deny audiences the opportunity to engage with satire, critique, and humor that challenge the dominant political narrative. This weakens the democratic process itself, because democracy thrives not on uniformity of thought but on the friction of diverse perspectives. Without that friction, without those voices willing to poke fun at the powerful, the conversation becomes dull, sanitized, and ultimately controlled. That is not democracy in action, it is democracy diminished. The argument that corporations are merely protecting their bottom line fails to account for the broader social responsibility they hold when they control such massive platforms. Disney is not simply an entertainment company. It is a cultural powerhouse whose decisions influence global discourse. With such power comes the obligation to consider more than just profit margins. To surrender to political pressure in order to avoid controversy is, therefore, not only an act of corporate cowardice but a betrayal of the role that media companies play in fostering a healthy, democratic society. It is an admission that profit takes precedence over principle, and that the voices of critics can be silenced if they become too inconvenient for those in power. The influence of Donald Trump on media and culture has always been both undeniable and controversial, and the decision by Disney to cancel Jimmy Kimmel underlines the extraordinary reach of that influence. Media is often described as a mirror of society, but in moments like this, it is more of a battleground where competing narratives clash. Trump's presence has shaped this battleground in ways no other modern political figure has managed, exerting pressure not just on political institutions but on cultural platforms where entertainment, satire, and journalism overlap. To understand the weight of this, we must consider how the Trump era has blurred lines between politics and entertainment, how it has weaponized outrage, and how it has reshaped the willingness of corporations to engage with or retreat from controversy. From the beginning of his political career, Trump understood the power of media spectacle. As a former reality television star, he grasped that visibility and controversy were more powerful than policy details or traditional campaigning. He thrived on dominating headlines, on ensuring that his name was constantly in the cycle, whether for praise or criticism. This strategy forced media outlets, willingly or unwillingly, to center him in their coverage, and soon that gravitational pull extended into entertainment spaces as well. Late-night hosts like Jimmy Kimmel, Stephen Colbert, and others became fixtures in this new era of political comedy, using Trump's constant stream of provocations as material for satire. Yet, what began as humor quickly evolved into cultural resistance, with comedians becoming some of the most visible critics of his administration. This dynamic did not sit quietly with Trump or his supporters. Rather than accept late-night satire as part of American tradition, Trump often lashed out directly, using social media platforms to attack comedians, television hosts, and media outlets. He accused them of spreading fake news, of being unpatriotic, and of unfairly targeting him. This created a feedback loop. The more comedians criticized him, the more he responded with attacks, which in turn gave them more material. But beneath the surface of this spectacle, something deeper was happening. Trump was redefining the relationship between politicians and media culture, positioning himself not as a subject of satire but as a central player in the cultural war over truth, respect, and legitimacy. The decision by Disney to cut ties with Kimmel, framed as an appeasement of Trump's influence, illustrates how effective this cultural strategy has been. By making criticism of Trump costly, whether through boycotts, political threats, or relentless social media campaigns, he and his allies created a climate in which corporations weigh the risks of allowing anti-Trump voices on their platforms. The message is clear: opposing Trump, even through comedy, is not just entertainment, it is a political stance that could bring consequences. For corporations that prioritize stability and profit, the safer route often becomes silence, and in silencing, they validate the very pressure that Trump exerts. Cultural influence, in this sense, extends beyond the content of jokes or the headlines of the day. It changes the boundaries of what is considered acceptable to say in public spaces. When a late-night host loses their platform for mocking or criticizing Trump, other cultural figures take notice. Writers, filmmakers, musicians, and journalists absorb the lesson: if you push too hard against powerful political figures, you risk not only backlash but also your livelihood. This creates a ripple effect, a form of self-censorship where people begin to avoid topics or soften their critiques out of fear of crossing an invisible line. Trump's influence, therefore, is not just about dominating the media cycle, it is about reshaping the very terms of engagement, ensuring that criticism carries real costs. This cultural reshaping has broader implications for democracy. Comedy and satire have historically played an essential role in challenging leaders, exposing hypocrisy, and giving people a way to laugh at power rather than bow to it. When that tradition is interrupted by fear of political retaliation, society loses one of its safety valves. Kimmel's cancellation, under pressure that is ultimately traceable back to Trump's ability to intimidate cultural gatekeepers, diminishes the space for satire in public discourse. The absence of such voices makes the political environment less dynamic, less critical, and more controlled by those who wield the loudest power. At the same time, this moment reflects how Trump has become a cultural symbol, not just a political one. Supporters and critics alike view him not simply as a former president but as an embodiment of values, attitudes, and identities. To mock Trump is, in the eyes of his base, to mock them. To challenge him is to challenge their worldview. This is why corporate decisions about how to handle anti-Trump content become so charged. They are not merely about programming or comedy, they are about aligning, intentionally or not, with one side of a cultural divide. Disney's decision thus becomes part of a broader cultural war, one in which neutrality is almost impossible and every choice is interpreted as a political act. Trump's influence also extends into the way media companies perceive their audiences. Corporations calculate not just how Trump himself might respond, but how millions of his supporters might react. Boycotts, social media campaigns, and viral outrage have become powerful tools in shaping corporate behavior. In an age where public opinion can be measured instantly through trending hashtags and online backlash, companies like Disney are acutely aware that angering a political movement as fervent as Trump's base carries risks. By yielding to that pressure, however, they inadvertently amplify it, teaching political figures and their supporters that outrage is an effective tool for silencing dissent. It is also important to consider how Trump's influence reshapes cultural narratives about authority and humor. Where previous presidents often brushed off satire as part of the job, Trump treated it as a direct threat to his legitimacy. His repeated insistence that comedians and critics were part of a broader conspiracy against him transformed satire from light-hearted entertainment into perceived political warfare. For Trump's supporters, laughing at their leader was framed as disrespecting the nation itself. This cultural reframing further polarizes the role of media, making it harder for satire to function as a unifying force and instead casting it as a weapon in an ongoing cultural struggle. In this environment, the cancellation of a late-night host is more than just a programming decision. It is a marker of how far Trump's cultural influence has extended, shaping not only the content of what is said on television but also the limits of what corporations are willing to tolerate. The chilling effect of this influence reverberates across media, art, and culture, narrowing the space for dissent and making it clear that criticism of Trump carries a cost. The silencing of voices like Kimmel's is not an isolated event but part of a larger pattern where political power dictates cultural boundaries, and where corporations, rather than defending free expression, often choose the path of least resistance. Congress in chaos has become a defining theme of American politics in recent years, and in the context of Jimmy Kimmel's cancellation and Disney's capitulation to political pressure, it highlights how institutional dysfunction creates an environment where corporate decisions carry outsized political significance. When Congress is paralyzed by partisanship, unable to legislate effectively or to protect fundamental democratic values, the vacuum of authority allows other powerful actors, from corporations to media figures, to step into roles they were never meant to occupy. The result is a democracy where the institutions designed to ensure balance and accountability are gridlocked, and where cultural decisions, like whether a comedian can criticize a president, become proxy battles for political struggles that Congress can no longer resolve. The chaos in Congress is not accidental. It is the product of deep polarization, where lawmakers treat each other less like colleagues and more like enemies. Bipartisanship has become rare, compromise nearly impossible, and even the most basic functions of government, passing budgets, confirming appointments, keeping agencies funded, are routinely held hostage by partisan brinkmanship. This dysfunction does more than frustrate the legislative process. It erodes public trust. Citizens who see endless squabbles, government shutdowns, and performative hearings come to view Congress not as a body that represents their interests but as a theater of political gamesmanship. When trust in Congress declines, so too does faith in the system as a whole, and that creates fertile ground for authoritarian tendencies to take root. In such a climate, the intersection of politics and culture becomes magnified. When Congress is unable or unwilling to stand up for principles like free expression, the responsibility shifts to cultural institutions, media companies, and even comedians to defend those values. Yet those institutions are not built to withstand political intimidation. They lack the constitutional grounding and legal protections that Congress is supposed to uphold. So when corporations like Disney face pressure from political figures or their supporters, they act not as defenders of principle but as businesses calculating risks. The chaos in Congress, therefore, directly contributes to the vulnerability of cultural figures like Kimmel, because the institutional bulwark that should protect dissent has collapsed under partisan warfare. The dysfunction in Congress also mirrors the spectacle-driven nature of modern politics. Much like Trump's strategy of dominating the media cycle with constant controversy, members of Congress often prioritize soundbites and viral moments over serious policy debates. Congressional hearings are increasingly platforms for grandstanding rather than governance, designed more to score points on cable news than to address the issues facing the country. This cultural shift makes Congress less a forum for problem-solving and more a stage for conflict, and that chaos spills over into the broader political culture. When citizens watch lawmakers behave like entertainers and entertainers become political actors, the lines between governance and performance blur beyond recognition. In that blur, the cancellation of a comedian becomes a political event, while congressional dysfunction becomes just another show. The impact of this chaos reaches beyond the perception of dysfunction. It undermines the very checks and balances that are supposed to restrain abuse of power. In a healthy democracy, Congress serves as a check on executive overreach and as a protector of civil liberties. But when Congress is mired in infighting, it fails to hold leaders accountable. This failure emboldens those in power, who recognize that no meaningful consequences will come from their actions. The Trump regime, for example, exploited congressional weakness to expand executive influence, sidestep oversight, and frame critics as enemies of the state. Without a strong and functional Congress to push back, those narratives gain traction, leaving comedians, journalists, and cultural critics as some of the only public voices willing to challenge the narrative. Their silencing, in turn, becomes more significant because it highlights just how empty the institutional defense of democracy has become. This dysfunction is not without precedent, but its intensity in the current era is unprecedented. Filibusters, partisan gridlock, and government shutdowns have all occurred in the past, but the degree to which they now dominate congressional activity is staggering. Every major decision seems to teeter on the brink of collapse, and every debate is framed less in terms of policy and more in terms of political survival. Lawmakers are incentivized to cater to their bases, to perform ideological purity rather than pursue compromise, because media ecosystems reward conflict over cooperation. In such an environment, chaos is not just a byproduct of dysfunction, it is a strategy. The louder the chaos, the more it distracts from substantive issues, and the more it allows political leaders to shift blame elsewhere. The consequences of this strategy ripple outward. Citizens grow increasingly disillusioned with politics, disengaging from civic participation out of frustration. Voter apathy rises, and with it, the space for extremist voices grows. The collapse of congressional functionality therefore does not just stall legislation, it erodes the democratic fabric by convincing people that their government no longer works for them. Into that void step media figures, corporations, and cultural icons, who inadvertently become symbols of the broader political struggle. When Jimmy Kimmel criticizes a president, it resonates not just as comedy but as a form of resistance, because Congress is failing to provide that check. When Disney cancels him, it is seen not just as a business choice but as capitulation to political power, precisely because Congress has abdicated its role as guardian of democratic norms. The chaos in Congress also reflects a broader global trend where legislative bodies in democracies struggle against rising populism and authoritarian tendencies. Populist leaders thrive in chaos because it allows them to frame themselves as the only source of order. When Congress appears dysfunctional, it reinforces the narrative that traditional institutions are broken and that only strong, decisive leadership can fix them. This plays directly into the hands of figures like Trump, who thrive on undermining institutional legitimacy. Every government shutdown, every partisan standoff, every chaotic moment in Congress becomes evidence for the argument that the system is failing, and that argument fuels demands for alternatives that often come at the expense of democratic principles. In this way, the cancellation of a late-night comedian and the dysfunction of Congress are not unrelated events but deeply connected symptoms of a larger democratic crisis. Both reveal how chaos and political intimidation work hand in hand to reshape public discourse, silence dissent, and weaken democratic institutions. Congress's failure to act decisively, to rise above partisan squabbles, and to protect the principles it was designed to uphold has created a vacuum where cultural battles take on political importance and corporate decisions substitute for democratic ones. In that vacuum, chaos becomes not just a description of Congress but the defining condition of American politics, eroding the boundaries between governance, culture, and power.